Hi, guys. My presentation today is over oppression, specifically racial oppression within the juvenile justice system. Today, you'll need a sheet of paper to write down some quick responses, or if you'd like to, you can email me at lmdecker@butler.edu, and you can even send it to me and I'll review it later. But one thing, Cliff, you'll have to watch the number of times you use the F word. Even I have a limit, and I'll tell on you. Okay, here's my title page. We're going to start with an activity before I launch into everything. So I'm going to ask you a few questions, and I'll give you time to jot down your responses. So I'll ask you verbally, and then I'll show you the question like this. And then I'll wait and give you a few seconds to respond, and then I'll reveal the correct answer. Sound like a plan? Okay, let's start. Question number 1. How many juveniles do you think are held in residential placement facilities on any given day in the United States? Okay, answer. Okay, question number 2. What is the average age of juveniles held in residential placement facilities in the U.S.? Here's the question. Answer. Okay. Great job. Third and final question. Out of approximately 1,055 juveniles in residential facilities in the state of Indiana, how many of those juveniles do you believe are black males, and how many of those juveniles do you believe are white males? Here's the question. And answer coming. Ready? Here's the answer. So to discuss systemic racism that is holding our justice system back from being, well, honestly, just, it's holding our system captive, we first have to talk about structural racism. The definition of structural racism is the normalization and legitimization of several dynamics. Those dynamics include historical, cultural, institutional, and interpersonal. Structural racism routinely disadvantages and produces chronic adverse outcomes for minorities. It's also defined as a hierarchy and inequity, which is characteristic of white supremacy, as it gives preferential treatment to white people at the expense of people of color. Structural racism manifests itself in inequities of power, access, opportunities, and policies. Let me provide a couple of examples of what structural racism looks like that is prevalent across the United States. So according to a study done by the NAACP in 2016, complaints made by white citizens are 2/3 more likely to be sustained by the police force than complaints made by black citizens. Another example includes a study done by the ACLU in Milwaukee in 2017, where black drivers are 6 times more likely to be stopped by the police than white drivers. That's structural racism. Another term that requires discussion is racialization. Racialization is a concept used by social scientists to refer to someone or something according to race. To racialize something is to impose a racial context or to perceive or experience it in racial terms. In the context of a juvenile courtroom, racialization manifests itself in several ways, including the linguistic codification of race that's based on stereotypes, which then influence decisions made by judges or prosecutors. Also, it manifests itself in narratives that lawyers, probation officers, police, any actor in a courtroom setting, that they use to baseline norms. So, in other words, norms that are used to distinguish good kids from bad kids. And please keep in mind that these norms are informed by white culture. Finally, racialization manifests itself in the juvenile courtroom in epithets that serve as racially biased judgments of the juvenile defendant, as opposed to an objective analysis of each child. And examples of these racialized epithets include broken home, negative peer group, high crime neighborhood. When these epithets in particular are used, 9 times out of 10, a black male defendant is on the stand. Okay, so that's a lot of information. Why is it necessary to begin with those 2 terms? Because despite the fact that adolescents across race lines commit criminal acts at the same rate, the juvenile justice system is made up of poor children of color. Why is that? And so I have another activity for you to do. I'm going to show you a series of pictures, and after that, I'd like for you to respond to what they all have in common. Why am I showing you these pictures together? Ready? These are leg irons. Shackles. Hog ties. Restraint chair. What do they all have in common? So if you answered that these are tools of restraint used in juvenile detention centers, then you would be correct. But if these images also conjure up ideas or remind you of the types of enslavement tools used during this country's worst period of history, when human bondage was acceptable and legal, you are also correct. You see, many argue that youth prisons are the legacy of slavery. Let me say that again. Youth prisons are the legacy of slavery. Across the United States, black youth are 5 times more likely to be incarcerated than white youth. In Virginia, they are 6 times more likely. And in New Jersey, the last northern state to abolish slavery, 2 years after emancipation, black youth are 30 times more likely to be incarcerated. In Kansas, the school building widely celebrated in Brown versus Board of Education, it sits just a few miles away from the Kansas Correctional Facility for Juveniles, which was built after the Civil War at a time period when most juvenile detention centers were being rapidly constructed across the country. To best represent what oppression in the juvenile justice system looks like, I'm going to show you a visual representation of the history of our country. Mass incarceration is the modern manifestation of racial discrimination. When a disproportionate number of people of color are arrested for the same crime that white people commit, that makes the justice system a tool for social control, which is slavery repurposed. In his book, Power and Difference, author Alan G. Johnson states that an oppressive system often seems stable only because it limits our lives and imagination so thoroughly that we can't see anything else. There are currently 50,000 youth imprisoned in juvenile facilities. Please consider taking an anti-racist approach and take action. check out these websites: nokidsinprison.org and youthfirstinitiative.org. Long before I became a public school educator, I felt it was necessary to care for the people in my community. I'm not sure I knew then that the desire or the calling would materialize in a 20-year-long career working side by side with students of color, but I know that I wouldn't have it any other way. Like many teachers, school counselors, and otherwise caregivers and helpers, my students are part of my village, and my job goes far beyond teaching the elements of reading and writing. My job also is to keep my students safe from harm to my fullest and greatest extent. And that's why it's important for all of us to be aware of the oppression that lies within otherwise benevolent institutions such as the juvenile justice system. But we have to do more than just be aware. We have to take action to change them. When these institutions do more harm than they do good, which is the case for my students of color, for minorities across this country, for children, then it's necessary to take action. So thank you for listening to my presentation, and I have posted a couple discussion questions for you to look at. Thanks, guys. Bye. Miss you.